you a woman in medicine feeling overwhelmed and disconnected from the personal fulfillment that you desire? You're in the right place. Join Doctors Joanne and Aaron as they rewrite the rules for women in medicine. Let's begin.
In today's podcast, I'm going to be interviewing my amazing co-host, Dr. Joanne Sotelo, psychiatrist and physician coach, and she's going to be sharing with us her input about the topic of shame. And I don't think we talk enough about the topic of shame in medicine. And I would love for you, Joanne, to help us define shame and let us know, how does it show up in medicine?
Thank you, Erin. Shame is one of those heavy words, like maybe guilt even, that we don't talk about, which is part of the definition, right? Like it thrives in secrecy and silence. And it might be one of those words that we're like, oh, I don't have shame. But then when we think of how it often leads to perfectionism, overwork, hiding mistakes, and fearing judgment, and think of it as a very strong, intense, almost painful emotion. And behind it is a belief that we are flawed, unworthy, and unlovable. So we might not hear those words, but this is what I do hear from other women in medicine. I did something bad. I am bad, right? Like it's the difference between that guilt of I did something bad and then the shame of I am bad. And it's that internalization of all of that can lead to so many negative consequences. And maybe in medicine, we see it more and I'm sure that a lot of us can relate, that we feel like we're not good enough, even though we're so highly accomplished. And then we don't ask for help because we don't want to admit the struggle, right? Like if I need help, I'm weak, and I'm using my air quotes. It's also perfectionism disguised as professionalism, or when we start comparing ourselves, which is usually not to our benefit. And then we end up telling ourselves like I should have it together, or I should be doing better. All those things that start with the should. And the avoidance of vulnerability or our authenticity because we're afraid of rejection. And that can even be linked to burnout and exhaustion, because carrying that shame, again, it's one of those heavy emotions that can be very mentally and emotionally draining. And then, unfortunately, I mean, it might look good for a little bit, but then we overcompensate. We work harder, longer, right? Like we want to make it all perfect. And it can also create isolation because those are things that we don't really want to talk about, that we rather hide.
That's so helpful to have that understanding, because as we've shared on other episodes, Joanne, sometimes the word we use, we may not resonate with shame, but those other words about hiding mistakes, perfectionism disguised as professionalism, then maybe some of those resonated with our listener if the word shame did not. And I think you've probably also studied with Brene Brown's writings, and she's a psychologist, I believe, married to a physician, and does a ton of work on shame. So if you haven't read Brene Brown's work, really helps us understand. She talks about the voice inside our head, and it follows the negative bias, right? Your brain will always make something up to finish the story that you don't know. You're going to make it about yourself, and you're going to make it negative. And that just adds fuel to that fire of shame and feeling worthless, unworthy. So thank you for helping us hear that in a manner that might make it easier to understand for healthcare providers and women in medicine. And speaking of women in medicine, why does it matter so much for physicians and healthcare providers?
So this is where shame can make it even more difficult for women in medicine, because, and this is not going to come to a surprise if you're a listener to our podcast, because these are some of the things that we've talked about. There's the cultural pressures, right? Like that sense of that external and internal expectation that we carry that double burden of being this really good physician in a male-dominated space, and also meeting societal and family expectations. So that's huge because we're always feeling that we're not good enough in either way, that we're falling behind, that we're not doing as much as other people. And again, when your brain compares, it's usually not to your benefit. So we have to be very careful with that. Another place is how we use perfectionism as a way to protect ourselves. If we can just push and do a little bit more, and right, like we compensate with performance and over functioning, and that just feeds the shame. But it looks pretty for a little while. So that's a tricky one. I know that I've fallen into that one of kind of compensating with more work, and it makes us feel good. But really, what are the emotions behind it? What's the driver? Another important thing is silence and secrecy. And like I said before, how that can lead to isolation and even struggles with anxiety and depression and the mental health stigma that we talk about. All of that compounds the shame, and then we just want to hide, and we have that fear of judgment and the career consequences and all those things that we've talked about. And then, of course, the impact on well-being, because chronic shame is not good for our overall sense of self and mental, emotional health. It fuels exhaustion. Again, it erodes our confidence, and it can increase our risk for depression, substance abuse, burnout, and anxiety. So this is serious. Again, we might want to dismiss it, but think of how it can be showing up in your life in those kind of subtle ways.
I want to add to that. I heard recently about the impact for women. And as you share that second shift where women are burdened with more of the child care and the household duties, even if they're working, even if they're a physician. And yet, if you have a messy household, which many of the women are not, able to keep up with that, with all the other things. At least many of the women that I've worked with have shared the burden of that. There is a negative consequence for women when their household is cluttered or messy, and it decreases their mental well-being differently than it does for men. So not only are we saddled with that most of the time, we also have consequences if we're not doing it, I'm going to do the air quotes, good enough. And oftentimes we can be resistant to asking for help. I'm constantly encouraging my clients, hire a housekeeper, get help with the yard, delegate, hire a babysitter so you can have some downtime. And we're so competent that we oftentimes resist the very help that can help us get out of the rut, and not recognizing I had no idea there was a difference in how a messy household impacts women differently from men. And it's important to be aware of that, because that's just one more thing adding to your burden. And so, Joanne, I'm always curious to tap into your wisdom. What can we do about shame?
Yes. And so the first thing is that we need to, like we always say, it's that recognizing it, naming it, and having the awareness that it's there without judgment, but rather self-compassion. And I love this question because we have to de-identify from the shame. And it's a fair question when we start beating ourselves up with shame to ask ourselves, is this guilt about what I did or what happened, or shame about who I am? And sometimes just asking the right question can give us enough of a pause to zoom out and have more awareness of, wait, maybe it was an event, something that happened, and it has nothing to do with who I am, which is what kind of the shame is so draining, because we internalize it like it's a flaw, and it's not that. Second step is to break the silence. Like we're doing here in this podcast, we're bringing up topics that are not always popular to talk about or easy to talk about. So talk about shame. And if you're feeling that way with a peer group, in coaching, in therapy, or with a friend, a colleague, right? Like Erin and I are doing here, because sometimes just saying it out loud and having someone hearing you out can reduce its power, can really, and can, again, could be a way for you to step out a little bit and de-identify from the emotion. The third one, which is part of why I love coaching, is that we can shift the narrative. Things like replacing perfectionism with self-compassion. When I'm coaching and we're asking difficult questions, I always remind the women physicians I coach, I always remind them, remember, no judgment, but rather self-compassion. And that's a beautiful shift right there. And reframing mistakes, maybe telling yourself, I made a mistake. We're human, but I'm still worthy and growing. What's the lesson here? Because our automatic thing is to beat ourselves up. And boy, are we good at beating ourselves up, right? Which just fuels the shame so quickly. Fourth one is that we can practice courage. You were mentioning Brené Brown, and she talks so much about that, like the vulnerability, and then the other side of the coin of being courage. And we can practice it in small ways, in sharing one vulnerable truth with a trusted peer, saying, I don't know, without shame, and celebrating our imperfections. Again, thank you for bringing Brené Brown. And I want to say that she's a social worker, like a doctorate in social work, but I might be wrong. I cannot remember what's her degree. Maybe we can check in later. And celebrating our imperfection, right? Like that's proof that we're human and lovely and full range of emotions there. That's something that she talks about. And then one of our favorite things, this last step, is build a supportive community. Seek spaces where your authenticity is valued. That's what, again, I keep on talking about coaching, but I love our group coaching. When we get to know each other, it's trusting and we can share, and it's so open and it's so trusting, and then we can all benefit. And we can be fair and know that those are not easy to get, but make sure that you have a colleague, a friend, someone that you have that trust, so that you can bring some of these thoughts that can be stuck in your mind, making you feel that shame. And then you can also have a mentor or and model vulnerability for others, right? So we're talking about role modeling recently. So you can be a role model, and you can also seek out a role model to help you through this.
This is so powerful, Joanne. I've got so many notes, and I'm just going to highlight a few of the things that you talked about. You talked about how we can have that perfectionism that can create shame, that we fear judgment, and also that we oftentimes can overcompensate and just work harder trying to make up for what we see as a lack when we're comparing. And you, again, bring up that double burden that women have, not only working in medicine during the day, then coming home and starting the second shift of taking care if you've got children or household duties, and then the impact that can have on us, especially when we feel like we're not doing either of them well, and that the negative self-talk we can do, beating ourselves up instead of meeting ourselves with self-compassion. I love how you talked about de-identifying ourselves from shame, and how can we start thinking of things in a different way. And for me, one of the superpowers I see having as a coach that works both in groups, at retreats, and one-on-ones, as Joanne does, is something someone might think is a weakness and beats themselves up on. Maybe I'm a new clinician and I'm asking for input from my colleagues because I want to be sure about the diagnosis. And I say, well, do you want to be just guessing and you don't know? Of course you're asking. As a new clinician, you're still in your learning curve. That's a good thing to do. And oftentimes sharing that outside perspective that they can't get from themselves. And so Joanne and I are often encouraging our listener, if you don't have the right support person, the right person you can reach out to or ask about or share these vulnerable things, find that support person, find that support network. And there are safe spaces out there where you can talk about those difficult things and find that you're not the only one. I remember an example where I was leading a group coaching session on efficiency and charting into the late hours. And I had 2 women 2 weeks in a row show up and say, I am the worst charter in the world. And the person who had said it the second week wasn't there the first week. So she'd missed the gal in the Zoom box right next to her who said the exact same thing. And imagine now those two are connected and they say, I'm not the only one. And chances are, to our listener, if you are struggling with something, you are not the only one. If there's something you think is a mistake or that you're feeling shame about, you are probably not the only one. And we would encourage you to find that person or those people you can talk to so that you can get the help and support. So powerful. And Joanne, I bet you have at least one more nugget of wisdom to share with our listener about the topic of shame.
Yes, and thank you for your reflections. And I like to think of the antidote of shame is courage and compassion. And when we naming the shame, speaking it out loud, and reminding ourselves that it's our humanity and not our flawlessness that makes us worthy, we'll automatically feel better.
So good, so good. And I was going to say I looked up Brené Brown in case our listener is not familiar with her. She has a Bachelor of Social Work, a Master of Social Work, and a PhD, a Doctor of Philosophy in Social Work, so she is well qualified on those topics, and we'll put some links to her work in the show notes, as well as our recommendation that if you have not yet given us a rating or review and you're finding this information helpful and want to get it in front of others who might benefit, go ahead and pause, find those stars, and give us an honest rating or review. And stay tuned. The next episode is coming right up.
Do you want exclusive resources and the opportunity to connect with us? Then visit createmeaninginmedicine.com now, where you'll dive deeper into how you can create meaning in medicine. And if you're serious about optimizing your results, take 2 quick steps now. Connect with us on the website and tune in to the next episode.